In August 2025, Beijing struck Canada's agricultural heart with a hammer blow, a 75.8% tariff on Canadian canola seed exports. For an industry worth over $43 billion annually, employing more than 200,000 Canadians, the shockwaves were immediate. Shipments to China collapsed almost overnight. Futures prices tumbled by over 6%, and farmers in the prairies, long the backbone of Canada's global food trade, were left scrambling for answers. But beneath the surface, this wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a deliberate geopolitical signal that China, once Canada's most lucrative agricultural buyer, was willing to weaponize market access to extract political concessions. For Ottawa, the choice was now clear. Dependence had become vulnerability, and new alliances were no longer an option. They were a necessity. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth, one power shift at a time. Today, we uncover how China's canola tariffs are forcing Canada to rethink not only its agricultural trade, but the very architecture of its global alliances. If you want to understand how food security, supply chains, and geopolitical leverage are shaping tomorrow's economy, make sure to subscribe now. Because the story of canola is not just about farming, it's about who controls the future of trade in a fractured world. The immediate impact of Beijing's tariff was felt across the Canadian prairies within hours. Contracts that had been negotiated months in advance were suddenly unworkable, as Chinese buyers walked away from deals that now carried punitive costs. For many producers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, the loss was staggering. China had been buying billions of dollars worth of Canadian canola each year, with shipments sometimes accounting for half of all export volumes. When that door slammed shut, it exposed just how concentrated Canada's agricultural trade had become. Prices on the ICE Futures Exchange in Winnipeg slid more than 6% in a single week, the steepest decline in years. Farmers who had locked in loans based on projected cash flow now faced financial uncertainty, and local processors began to scale back operations. In rural communities, the anxiety was palpable. Saskatchewan, which alone produces 55% of Canada's canola, saw headlines warning of an economic downturn rippling through farm towns, equipment dealerships, and grain handling firms. The crisis was not limited to agriculture. Economists warned that the tariff could shave tenths of a percentage point off national GDP, given the size of the sector and its linkages to food, energy, and trade. Ottawa's phone lines lit up with calls from farm organizations demanding answers, while commodity traders scrambled to redirect shipments toward Europe and Japan. Yet even as alternatives were explored, the underlying reality could not be ignored. Canada's over-reliance on one buyer had been brutally exposed, and diversification was no longer a choice. It was survival. The immediate impact of Beijing's tariff was felt across the Canadian prairies within hours. Contracts that had been negotiated months in advance were suddenly unworkable, as Chinese buyers walked away from deals that now carried punitive costs. Prices on the ICE Futures Exchange in Winnipeg slid more than 6% in a single week, the steepest decline in years. Farmers who had locked in loans based on projected cash flow now faced financial uncertainty, and local processors began to scale back operations. The crisis was not limited to agriculture. Economists warned that the tariff could shave tenths of a percentage point off national GDP, given the size of the sector and its linkages to food, energy, and trade. While the canola tariff captured headlines, it was part of a larger pattern. For years, Canada and China had sparred over agricultural access, technology investments, and security disputes. By 2025, the relationship had entered open economic conflict. Earlier in the year, Beijing imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, effectively eliminating two major product lines. The August tariff on seed completed the blockade, shutting down the entire canola value chain. But China did not stop there. It expanded tariffs to Canadian steel, aluminum, and even electric vehicle exports, signaling that the retaliation was systematic, not sector-specific. What made the escalation more striking was its timing. Canada had recently aligned more closely with Washington on Indo-Pacific strategy, joining U.S.-led initiatives on critical minerals and regional security. By squeezing Canada's most valuable farm export, China was sending a message. Nations that support Washington's containment policies would feel economic pain. This strategy was not new. China had used similar tactics with Australia during disputes over COVID-19 inquiries, and with Lithuania after its deepened ties to Taiwan. But Canada's vulnerability was unique because of how central canola had become to both the national economy and Beijing's food supply. The tariff was used as a tool of pressure, exposing interdependence in a way that revealed the broader logic of the trade war. China was turning agricultural markets into instruments of statecraft. For Ottawa, this forced a reckoning. The canola crisis was not a one-off. It was part of a larger, more dangerous chess game of economic coercion. The political response inside Canada was swift and intense. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, representing the province most exposed to the crisis, announced plans to travel to Beijing in a bid to reopen talks and secure relief for farmers. His move underscored the stakes. With billions in exports at risk, provinces were willing to conduct diplomacy directly. At the federal level, Agriculture Minister Heath MacDonald convened emergency meetings with provincial leaders, producer groups, and industry stakeholders. Ottawa promised immediate support through business risk management programs designed to stabilize incomes and prevent a collapse in farm credit. But officials also recognized that subsidies alone could not solve the problem. Canada prepared to file a complaint with the World Trade Organization, arguing that Beijing's tariffs constituted unjustified trade restrictions. Yet insiders acknowledged that even a favorable WTO ruling could take years, leaving producers stranded in the meantime. In the diplomatic sphere, Ottawa began quietly lobbying allies in Europe and Asia, asking them to expand quotas for Canadian canola, while positioning the country as a reliable alternative to more volatile suppliers. The crisis also spilled into domestic politics. Opposition parties accused the government of failing to diversify markets earlier, while farm organizations demanded long-term solutions rather than temporary relief. Newspapers carried stories of families reconsidering whether the next generation should stay on the land. The canola dispute was no longer confined to trade statistics. It had become a political flashpoint shaping Canada's economic identity, its foreign policy posture, and its credibility as a partner in global supply chains. While politicians debated, farmers adapted in real time. Across the prairies, growers began reallocating acreage away from canola and into spring wheat, oats, and pulses, crops less exposed to Chinese tariffs. Analysts predicted a surge in spring wheat production for 2026, with ripple effects across rail shipping, grain elevators, and futures markets. The shift was pragmatic. Wheat had more diversified demand, and global prices were supported by supply shocks in other regions. At the same time, Canada's energy transition created new opportunities. Biofuel producers began investing in canola oil as a domestic feedstock under the Clean Fuel Standard. transforming a crop once aimed primarily at export markets into a pillar of national energy security. Trade officials doubled down on international diversification, targeting CPTPP members like Japan and Vietnam, as well as European buyers through CETA. Southeast Asia emerged as a promising growth market, with governments eager to secure long-term supply contracts. This move reframed canola as more than food. It became an input for the green economy, tying farmers to the rising demand for renewable diesel. The pivot was not without cost, but it signaled a decisive break from old assumptions. Canada was no longer betting on a single buyer. Instead, it was spreading risk across continents, industries, and even domestic energy systems. The canola crisis, while painful, was accelerating the reinvention of Canada's agricultural trade model. The deeper lesson of the canola crisis was that agriculture had become a front line in global power politics. For decades, food exports were treated as relatively apolitical, products that moved according to demand and price. But China's tariffs showed that in today's world, food is a tool of leverage as powerful as steel, energy, or technology. By weaponizing access to its market, Beijing reminded every exporting nation that dependence is a vulnerability. For Canada, the warning was stark. The country could no longer rely on global rules or institutional safeguards alone. WTO mechanisms were too slow, and bilateral negotiations could be overridden by political disputes. Instead, resilience had to come from diversification and alliance building. Every ton of canola redirected to Europe, Japan, or Southeast Asia was more than an economic adjustment. It was a geopolitical signal. This crisis also reshaped Canada's alliances. By leaning harder into partnerships with Europe and the Indo-Pacific, Ottawa strengthened its alignment with democracies pursuing their own de-risking strategies. The geopolitical lesson was clear. In an age of fractured trade blocs, agriculture is not just a business. It is a strategic asset, and those who control its flows wield power far beyond the farm. For Canada, the lesson is simple but profound. Trade is no longer just about selling goods. It is about defending sovereignty. Canada's response to China's canola tariffs is more than a short-term economic adjustment. It is a recalibration of its role in the global trading system. For decades, Canadian agriculture operated under the assumption that China, with its vast population and insatiable demand for food, would always be a reliable growth market. What emerges in its place is a more cautious, more diversified approach. By leaning into agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Ottawa signals its intent to strengthen ties with Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore. Through CETA, it is already positioning canola as a strategic input for Europe's growing renewable fuel industry. At the same time, the push for domestic biofuel demand transforms canola into a national security asset, fueling Canada's own transition to cleaner energy and reducing exposure to external shocks. Yet the consequences are not just economic. Politically, this crisis cements a deeper alignment with Western allies who are also recalibrating their trade exposure to China. Economically, it marks the beginning of a more resilient model, one in which Canadian farmers and exporters cannot be held hostage to a single market. And geopolitically, it is a warning to all nations. In an era of fractured trade blocs and rising tariffs, alliances are not just diplomatic gestures. They are shields against vulnerability. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is this simply diversification or the start of a Western supply chain revolution? Either way, the world is watching. This was China's Canola Tariffs force Canada to rethink its alliances. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you in the next video.